Father Walsh was a diocesan priest from the Archdiocese of Boston. He had learned about the missions from the priests, the French priests that were teaching in the seminary. After he spent some time in parish work after his ordination, he was asked to be director of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith in Boston. And the Society for the Propagation of the Faith was just getting underway in the United States. But he took the job very readily and began raising money. And it was in that context that he realized that there had to be more accessible literature, publications about the missions to educate the American Catholic clergy and population. So in 1906, he began to put together this magazine, which came out in 1907 in its first issue, The Field Afar. And when Maryknoll was founded in 1911, it would become the magazine of the new society, the new Maryknoll Society.
Father Price was an older priest than Father Walsh. He was 10 years older, and he had been a missionary in North Carolina for some 25 years. Then he found out that Father Walsh also had an interest. Father Walsh's interest was predominantly foreign missions, and the two of them got together in the Eucharistic Congress in Montreal, and they found out they were both thinking along the same lines. Walsh, at first, he didn't think of forming a society or anything like that if somebody else would do the work. Cardinal O'Connell of Boston was Father Walsh's boss, because Father Walsh was the priest, diocesan priest of Boston. It was Father Price who goes to Cardinal O'Connell and gets permission from Cardinal O'Connell for Father Walsh to do this type of work. It wasn't Father Walsh having the, if you will, the courage to ask himself, but Father Price arranges it all. So with regard to the hierarchy, the relationship with the hierarchy, the cardinal, the apostolic delegate, the Cardinal of New York, the Cardinal of Boston, it was Father Price who was running around making all these, which kind of shows the importance of Father Price's contribution to the founding of the society.
At that point, they're working very closely together, and in Price's mind, apparently, was that the community that's going to be formed here will be one that will have overseas missions and be also open to vocations to work in the home mission. Now, it's not until they're actually on the boat going over to Europe, after the bishops approved them, they were instructed to go to Rome and get the approval of the Pope, Pope Pius X. It's on the boat going over on the ship that Price realizes that Walsh really wants the society to be exclusively foreign mission. And that's very hard for Father Price because he's going to have to part with something he thought was going to be enhanced by adding the foreign mission element. Price accepted it as a cross. So from that point on, it's a substantial adjustment that Price has to make. And Walsh probably had to make it as well because although his view prevailed, he could see the pain that it was causing Father Price.
These pictures show, first of all, Father Walsh as I first knew him. I went to his office and I found him just about as he is sitting there now. The building was a ramshackle old place. The neighborhood was poor. Well, that was Father Walsh's office. Now, on that day that I made that famous visit to him, I saw the proof sheet of the first copy of the first Field of Bar, and I've always considered that a very great privilege as I look back now over the years. I remember I realized, of course, that Father was a very busy man, and I said to him, well, I must be going now. I see that you're represented. Oh, no, he said, you sit down. I'm trying to form an opinion of you. he always said after that he really never could have said anything so rude. Well, I said you did, and I was very uncomfortable. But anyway, I stayed, and as I was leaving, he said, I think you and I are going to be friends.
Molly Rogers, who became Mother Mary Joseph, founders of the Maryknoll Sisters, was a young woman from Jamaica Plain near Boston. She had studied at Smith College, a non-sectarian school, a school that happened to have a strong mission interest. Young women were volunteering for Protestant mission endeavors around the world. She organized there, at the encouragement of faculty, a Catholic mission club. And as she sought to find out more about Catholic missions herself, she went down to Boston, visited James Anthony Walsh to get some pictures, to get some ideas, to get some literature. He was struck by her sincere commitment to mission.
He eventually saw that God was calling him to make this foundation of a society, more than just educate, but to himself do that. And it was Father Price who said to him, let's do it, that day in Montreal at the Eucharistic Congress in 1910. September 10th, they agreed that they would attempt to do this together. And 5 days later, back in Boston, Molly made a formal dedication of her life to this work on September 15th. That strikes me as very interesting. The three of them, within a 1 week's period, decided and moved toward that. So they really, you can really see the three founders, and each one had their contribution to make.
The first Maryknoll mission group was sent to the Orient, sent to China in 1918. Father Price was asked by James Anthony Walsh, with his mission experience and so forth, to serve as the superior of that group. The other three were very young, recently ordained. James E. Walsh, who would be the successor someday of James Anthony Walsh. Father Ford, who would eventually give his life in China under the communists in a communist prison in 1954. And Father Bernard Meyer, who worked many years in China and was a great influence in terms of missionary thinking. So they were an exceptional group. They write very well. Their accounts in the Field of Far and other magazines are very engaging from that time. And Price was their superior, and unfortunately could only spend a few months with them before he died really of an affected appendix. He was only 59, but that was considered elderly at that time. Rome at that time in general was encouraging missioners to go to China, and they were particularly interested in having English-speaking missioners go who were Catholic. There were thousands of Protestant missionaries in China from the United States. The apostolic delegate in China at the time, a man by the name of Costantini, was very interested in art, and he was interested in Chinese art and Chinese style. And he encouraged missioners to take a look at Chinese architecture and so forth and see if that could not be more readily used in the missions. And we, of course, come into existence just at that time, so we're open to that, fine. And James Anthony Walsh's brother was an architect. As we proceed to build this new building, which they began in the early 20s, let's give it a Chinese aspect so that our students will have an appreciation of Chinese style, and it will be a way of spelling mission to the wider Catholic public.
If you look at the beginnings of Maryknoll, the priests, the seminarians, and the sisters all lived together in different little houses over on the one compound. So the sisters always went up to the seminary for Mass and for everything, and they cooked for the boys and they did their laundry. So what you had was, and she looks back on it in 1920, was an informal development of the Maryknoll spirit, which becomes much more family spirit among them, because that's the way it developed naturally.
Bishop Walsh used to say one thing: remember, we started poor. We are poor and dependent upon the poor. Another thing he said very, very often was trust in the providence of God. And he taught us that. When he was here building the seminary, and not much money was coming in, and the Depression came, well, he was thrown by those circumstances and reliance on God. So he trusted providence in the building. He certainly did, but he worked himself. Secondly, he trusted providence in the personnel he had. He didn't know how many vocations he was going to get, but he trusted providence. He was reckless. He sent his best men to the missions.
Your motive is the thirst for souls. It is that which is carrying you over the seas. You go to bring Christ, and Christ crucified. You are to preach him crucified. You are to express to others his life by your life.
Father James Anthony Walsh died in 1936, and for the last year or two of his life he was quite sick. But Mother remained with him until the very end, and she used to say the office for him, and the relationship was, as it had always been, very close.
Archbishop McNicholas came to see Father Walsh shortly before he died, and he was so sick that they had to work it out, so he would visit for a short time and go out of the room, and then Walsh would recover some strength and he'd come back in. So everybody naturally was interested in knowing what McNicholas had heard from Father Founder, who's dying. And he said, it's amazing, he didn't talk a great deal about his society. He talked about Catholic University. He talked about any number of issues before the American bishops at this time. McNicholas was very, very impressed by this, and he mentions it again in his homily at St. Patrick's Cathedral. James Anthony Walsh was buried from St. Patrick's Cathedral. And McNicholas gave the homily and referred to this dimension of Walsh, which is a great legacy for us, to be concerned about not just our missions, as far-reaching and as wide out there as they are, but the whole church, the whole world.
The proper Bostonian. His background, everything about him, his whole life was, he was so punctilious and fatherly and pastoral and world vision, you know, the church's vision. This was all, he was born into it, it seems.
Much of the concrete day-to-day routine organization, from running the seminary to editing the magazine, fell to Walsh, and he was talented for that and was happy to do it.
When they were going to Rome for the first time to get permission from the Holy Father, and customarily Father Price was late, and he arrived shortly before the boat was to leave. Father Price was waiting, Father Walsh was waiting, and of course he was the administrator with all the details well in hand. Father Price arrives, he has nothing, he doesn't have his ticket, he doesn't have anything else. Father Walsh had everything for him. fortunately, money and things like that. And his remark was, he said, his name was Father James Walsh, he said, his remark, okay, let Jimmy do it. Jimmy will do it. Let Jimmy do the work. It kind of characterized, it was the only time I ever heard or read of Father Walsh saying something, frustrated a little bit with Father Price. Otherwise, they got along quite well together. Let Jimmy do it. Jimmy will do the work.
When he was made bishop in 1933, just 3 years before he died, the reason for that was his commitment to mission in general, of course, but to the education of the American Catholic about mission. That was expressly cited afterward as the reason why he had been singled out and made a bishop. Yes, he had a keen sense of the importance of pictures. So Walsh was determined to have a mission magazine that would tell the story in pictures. And so he encouraged missioners to take cameras with them to get pictures back, as well as stories for the magazine. As we move into the time of the society, we're into the time of silent film. He was following all of that very carefully and investing in material of that sort. And he realized, of course, that visual media were very important in that education. You could take it to a school and get great attention from the kids and from the teachers if you had interesting films to show.
Go forth, ye heralds. The centuries-old departure bell, which once hung in a pagan temple in Japan, rings but once a year, and then to sound the call to the east. The weird, strident plaint is the voice of the Orient, calling for the priest. San Francisco, and the President Line steamer weighs anchor for the long journey to the Orient. Last call and all ashore that's going ashore. The priest crowd the rail and give a final blessing to those below. And so farewell to the past and hail to the future. Hail to the years ahead and the waiting millions. The great vessel slowly moves. Goodbye, America. Out through the Golden Gate she sails in the path of the setting sun towards tomorrow's dawn across the great Pacific.
There were a lot of Maryknollers out in the field, but generally stayed in China, struggling along in very difficult and dangerous situations. That, I think, appealed to the American character, not in any false way, but just it was impressive. This is the kid down the block that's done this. he grew up and he went to this seminary, and now he's in China dodging Japanese bombs.
Historically speaking, things changed. We were thrown out by the communists, and then Rome asked us to go to Latin America and Africa, and we became, pretty much worldwide now.
James Anthony Walsh was very, very clear about going out to the poorest. I think the Second Vatican Council helped us to do that in a more conscious way, to be more conscious of making an option for the poor and to see the world from their point of view. I think the Second Vatican Council helped us to realize that God is at work in the world, calling all people to new life. And that sin takes various forms. It takes personal forms and it takes social forms. And that we are in situations of sin and we're called out of that, whether that is in terms of social justice or in terms of individual lifestyle.
It wasn't just a few theologians that were dreaming up liberation theology. It was the experience of the people, and it was the experience of the priests and our bishops. In the Salem conference, it was very obvious that the bishops were beginning to say the same thing, that we can no longer accept poverty and tell people to accept it. We have to help people understand what it means to be living a gospel, what it means to build or to expand the kingdom of God. It means social justice.
There is an institutionalized violence that is provoking the anger of the people. It's a violence that comes from the right, who want to maintain their privileges through oppression.
Monsignor Romero was assassinated because of his courageous voice, because he dared to speak about the injustices that were happening in the country.
Immediately on hearing the shocking reports of their tragic deaths, I joined a Mass here at St. Patrick's Cathedral and extended sympathy and assurance of prayers to the families, friends, and co-workers of those who were killed, especially to our own Maryknoll sisters.
Right from the beginning, this was held out to us as the symbol of the life of the missioner, was the martyr. Well, of course, most people don't think too much about it. I mean, you think that's a wonderful thing. But then it starts to happen. In Latin America, it was because not so much that we were Christians, because the very people who are doing some of this dreadful stuff in the military are sort of on the surface Christians. We don't consider that they really are, but they are. They're Catholics, you know, many. So it sounds like a different, it sounds, what are those nuns, you know, you hear people saying, why are those nuns getting mixed up in politics? Missing the whole picture that this isn't politics, this is people being killed for their land, or killed to get rid of them so the land can be taken over, you know. It's a different situation, but in fact, we look on it still as martyrdom, because you're laying down your life for the people, not with a gun in your hand, but with words on your lips.
We have structures for huge numbers. We have a self-image and a spirituality and a training for a large group. And now, over the past decade and a half, 2 decades, we're getting smaller and realizing perhaps we're getting normal. The huge numbers that we had in the early days, not only of Maryknoll, but various mission societies that were founded about the same time as we, those huge numbers were actually like a swollen ankle. And it wasn't normal, but we thought it was because it was all we knew. Now I think we're getting down to a manageable number of men who can be effective in mission. Small is beautiful.
I don't think that the answer is just numbers. I do think that the answer is also looking for new ways that people can be involved in mission. When Maryknoll started, priests, brothers, and sisters were involved in mission. I think today, priests, brothers, and sisters are involved in mission. Lay people are involved in mission. Lay people who are single and young. Lay people who are in a second and third career and who have wisdom and much training to offer. Families with children are involved in mission. People are involved in mission for their lifetime, and people can be involved in mission for a year, for 5 years, even for 2 or 3 months. So I think there are many new options that are coming about because of some of the changes in our world and some of the changes in our society, the way we live, and new possibilities.
Cecilia Stanton, Sam Stanton, Ceci, Mari, and Victor Stanton.
For a better world.
And I think that's what we could really appreciate about Maryknoll, the real integration of men, women, families, priests, celibates, married, singles, you know, the whole gamut. I think that's a real healthy integration here that's happening, and Maryknoll is really leading the way in many respects.
I think one of the great legacies of Popes Paul VI and John Paul II is their big thrust on recalling the Church to the fact that we exist for mission. We're not the country club for the saved. The only reason the Church exists is to share the message of Christ. And over the years, when we were focused on Europe and America, it was easy to forget that. We thought the job was finished. But we're realizing it's a big world still. Christians are still a minority. There are billions of people who have the right to know they're sons and daughters of God, and there's nobody around to give that message. So these two popes in particular have really stressed that need. And the Church is responding. Part of our mission is bringing the experience and the message of other churches back to the U.S. Church and saying, hey, take a look at these churches of Asia. Take a look at the church in Indonesia, suffering, persecuted, and committed to sharing what little it has with those who know nothing of Christ. So I think we're just at the very beginnings of a new age for mission.